Good morning, everyone. I'm Alexandra Ccca, the Executive Director of the Canadian Corporate Counsel Association. We would like to welcome all attendees joining us from across the country for today's webinar, which we have provocatively entitled Failure and Getting Comfortable with the F Word. I'd like to thank Legal Suite, our sponsor for today's program. Before we begin, though, there are a few housekeeping items. We are recording today's program, and you will receive a copy of the recording, as well as the slides that are being presented today. And we'll also send a survey out after the program to get your feedback on today's program and to solicit ideas for future programming. Our speaker, Ashley Good, will leave time at the end of her presentation to take your questions, which you can submit through the Q&A function. And similarly, any technical issues that you might experience, we ask you to reach out to Webcast Guru through the Q&A function. So once again, thank you to our sponsor, Legal Suite, and to Nabil Dean for working with us to bring this unique but very much needed session to us at a time of great uncertainty and change. I'm now pleased to turn over the microphone to Baptiste Arminiac, the Director of Business Development at Legal Suite, who will begin our session.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Alexandra, for the introduction. So I'm Baptiste Arminiac from Legal Suite. Thank you very much to be here today with us for this session. We are proud to be partner with Ccca to provide this training on soft skills on the failure topic. As software provider for legal professional, in-house and also private practice, we think that skills like resilience, empathy, and other soft skills are as important as legal or management skills because they help us to deal with sensitive and stressful situations. So that's the reason why we need to understand failure as part of our success and not the opposite way. At Legal Suite, we believe this webinar, and Ashley, will give us the keys to understand failure, and at the end, the keys to be our best selves and successful. So I hope you will enjoy it. And Ashley, it's time for you to rock and roll.
Thank you so much, Baptiste, Alexandra, and more broadly to Ccca and Legal Suite for making this session possible. So I am Ashley Good, and I am coming at you from Toronto, traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And I have the immense joy of getting to facilitate this hour-long session with you today all about failure. So I will say a little bit more about me and my company Fail Forward in a moment here, but to get us started, I actually wanted to start with a quick icebreaker activity. So I would invite everyone on the call to open up your Zoom chat boxes, and in that chat box, I invite you to type the first word that pops into your head when you think about failure. So there are no right or wrong answers to this. Absolutely any word is okay. Thank you. We've already got so many participants throwing their answers on this. This is great. This is a great chance to see how you all are showing up with respect to this concept of failure. Growth, disappointment, embarrassment, unacceptable, low self-worth. These are beautiful. Thank you. So I invite you to keep putting in your words if you haven't already. But I should say that I started my company, Fail Forward, almost a decade ago, basically to help people appreciate some of the nuance that we see showing up in your answers in the chat, that there's both that potential for growth inherent in failure. So if I help folks maximize what they can learn from past failures, there's also the potential to help folks take risks and innovate. We need that healthy relationship with failure to do that. So that's really the two sides of my business, both the learning and the innovation side, and of course, dealing with how kind of crappy and humiliating failure can be, to pull a few more words from the chat. So what I actually do on a day-to-day basis, sessions like these, obviously, skill building workshops, talks, I coach people, teams, executives, all that good stuff. I've been doing this for 10 years, so I get called a failure expert pretty often. But I happen to know that we are all failure experts. I mean, whether it's professional projects or personal endeavors, our relationships, it doesn't matter. Failure finds us all. So, and I don't necessarily see that as a wholly terrible thing. So far from being a failure expert, I see it as my job to help be a guide to see failure not as a wholly terrible thing. And really that's my goal for our hour together here, is that this hour can provide some guidance for you in building towards a healthy, more productive relationship with failure. So to give you a sense of what you have gotten yourself into signing up for a webinar all about failure, I'll give you a sense of what the hour is going to include. Basically, we've got this short intro, almost done now. The majority of our session, we are going to focus on 3 core concepts. I think about these, if we think about the pathway to a healthy relationship with failure, these are kind of like the guideposts, these core concepts. So those 3 are intelligent failure. What is it, and why is it so hard? What do we do about that? The second is the plague of perfectionism and how that fits into our ability to have a healthy relationship with failure. And the third core concept I'll cover is all around practically, what do we do with that? How do we actually put that into practice in our day-to-day when we fail? Now, after describing each core concept, I will put Nabil from Legal Suite will put a question in the chat box, and I'll pose this reflection question to you to invite you to reflect on how that concept plays in to your day-to-day, how it applies to your concept. So a lot of interactivity coming in the next hour. And of course, as Alexandra mentioned, we'll have time at the end for a Q&A as well. So but that doesn't mean you have to save your questions till the end. There's a Q&A function via Zoom. Feel free to put your questions into that Q&A as we go. I won't be watching it, but Christine and Nabil will, and they'll flag any questions that I should answer right away for you guys. And with that, unless there's any questions already, I think we're ready to hop into the 3 core concepts that move us towards this healthy relationship with failure. So as I mentioned, the first core concept is all around intelligent failure. What is it? Why is it so hard? And what might we do about that? So the first thing I'll say is simply that failure's bad. Obviously, we want success, but failure is also inevitable. So therefore, the most intelligent, wise, best thing that any of us can do is get really good at dealing with our failures well and intelligently. So I've thrown around this term, intelligent failure, so I should and will define it for you. But just before I do, I just want to highlight that I know that you intuitively already know what it means to fail intelligently. And I know that because I've asked dozens of groups to tell me what intelligent failure means to them, and I get these really robust, concrete, nuanced answers that are as good as any definition I could give you. So I'm sure everyone on this call, I know you already know that when we fail intelligently, learning, innovation, and failure are inextricably linked. And I articulate those links with the slide in front of you. This is my visual definition of what it means to fail intelligently. So I'll describe it briefly for you, again, recognizing that you already know this intuitively. Basically, it starts by assuming that some degree of failure is inevitable, and if we want that failure to lead to increased performance, we want to fail intelligently. We want to stay on that loop. That means detecting the failure early, analyzing it effectively, maximizing what we can learn from that failure, applying that learning, making sure we make the changes that are required so that we don't repeat that mistake again, and then inviting ourselves to take those risks and continue to innovate in the ways that are going to push our organizations forward, which of course leads to more failures the next time around the loop, but ideally this time more interesting and new failures the next time we go around. So again, we all know this. We know how we should respond in times of failure. So, why do I have a job? And I guess the short answer to that is we all know this. We all know what we should do, and none of us, myself included, actually manage to stay on this loop. And we don't manage to stay on this loop because at every step, most of our instincts, learned behaviors, and organizational structures cause us to exit the loop. So to give you a sense of what that looks, sounds, feels like, so you can start to see why intelligent failure is so hard, I'll start in the upper left there. You'd think detecting failure would be easy, right? We all know a failure when we see it. Well, I'm sure we've all been in this situation where we watch somebody who is failing and should be acknowledging their failure, but instead they're totally in denial. Either they're not getting the feedback or the information they need to see it as a failure, or because of cognitive biases, they're totally just ignoring it. I know for me, I often fall into that escalating commitment exit, where my spidey sense is tingling. I know something's not quite right, and I'm struggling, and I should ask for help and acknowledge that I'm failing, but instead I say, no, I'm going to figure this out. I'm doubling down on this. I'm just going to work till 5 in the morning until I pull this out of the wreckage, and sometimes that works, and that's fine. Although I would ask, at what cost? But sometimes it just means that by the time we have to detect failure, it's because the failure's gotten so big we can't deny it anymore. So we get to that detect failure stage. We still exit right away because for most of us, failure comes with such shame. And shame feels so bad that it pushes us almost immediately into our defensive mechanisms where we are blaming ourselves, self-criticizing, like trying to fix it before anyone notices, all of which undermines our ability to really examine and learn from that experience. Now, a lot of organizations have great processes around analysis that kind of pulls us back onto the intelligent failure loop. We have postmortems and after-action reviews, retrospectives, whatever you call them. But still, we tend to exit even when we do those processes because we tend to focus on the wrong things. We learn the wrong lessons where we're looking at, like, why did this happen? Who is responsible? Instead of asking, how did exceptional, talented, hardworking, intelligent people make the wrong call or see the wrong information or go the wrong direction? Because it's by asking that more open-ended question that we start to learn the lessons that we need to actually prevent that failure in the future, as opposed to just blame who's responsible. And even if we learn the right lessons, we often move on after that step. I can't tell you how many lessons learned reports I've seen that are just like collecting dust on a shelf somewhere. So if we manage to make the right changes and the required changes, we need to give ourselves a huge pat on the back because we are like ahead of 95% of folks. But we still have a tendency to exit there. Because while we should be totally congratulating ourselves and saying, hey, I'm like pretty good at this learning from failure business. I, detected it, learned from it, made the changes I needed to. That allows me more room to take risks and innovate. Instead, we're saying, I never want to go through that again. That was terrible. I'm just going to do what I know from now on so I never have to fail again. And so we still exit after that phase. So that is all to say, we think that we know how to fail intelligently. We think that because we know what intelligent failure means, that that's what we'll do, and none of us actually do it. The loop isn't the norm, the exits are the norm, which leads me to my first reflection question for you for this first concept of talking about intelligent failure and why it's so hard. My first reflection question for you, which I will invite Nabil from Legal Suite to paste into the chat box for us now, is which of the exits do you take most frequently and or have the toughest time getting out of? So I already mentioned I tend to fall into that escalating commitment one. I'm also a sucker for self-criticism. I will beat myself up a lot. That's another one of my exits. And I'd say the other one I fall into is the fear. If I have a big idea that I really want to put forward, I feel that resistance to actually putting it out there because of my own fear of failure. So what are yours? And I'll give you a few minutes to put your answers into the chat there. Yeah, we've got a real range showing up in the chat here. This is neat. Thank you all. Seems like all of them. I resonate with that one too. So I see a lot of self-awareness in your answers already. This is wonderful. Keep it up. And I think when I strive to articulate how we deal with this, like the loop isn't the norm, we want to do that, but all of our instincts and learned behaviors are gonna cause us to exit. It's not about trying to avoid those exits, because I can tell you with a great amount of certainty, you can't. Those are instincts. You're probably going to fall into those traps every time. What's really important is exactly what you're doing. It's recognizing where you tend to stumble on the pathway to intelligent failure, so that you can recognize when you're falling into shame or defensiveness or moving on without making the needed changes. Because that's how we recognize when we're doing the behavior that prevents us from failing intelligently and kind of pull ourselves back onto the intelligent failure loop, so that we can make the most of our failures. All right, thank you all. Okay, I love seeing your answers come in, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to core concept number 2. So with this increased awareness of how we practice intelligent failure, we can talk about that plague of perfectionism and how that fits in to this intelligent failure business. So I get it. I think even if you didn't start out a perfectionist, perhaps practicing law would make you a perfectionist. Your contracts need to be airtight. Your whole job is to protect your companies from risk. Failure is not an option. Essentially your job is to be right every single time. And yet this year, 2020, has made being right every single time, well, a little difficult. We've all had to adapt how and where we work. There's volatile markets, there's constantly changing business imperatives, not to mention all of the shakeups to our personal lives. We've had to innovate, we've had to adapt, and suddenly had to do all these things that we are not experts in. And I don't know about you, but I have failed more in the past 8 months than I have in the entire past 8 years, and that is not an exaggeration. So I know I probably don't need to say this again, but I will, just in case anyone's feeling alone in this moment. Like right now, more than ever, failure is absolutely inevitable. There's just so much uncertainty, so much change, and that uncertainty means that our tendency towards perfectionism or perfectionist thinking is, yes, totally unrealistic, but actually worse than that. It's really, really unhelpful. And it's unhelpful because well, most of us tend to believe that our perfectionism, like that rigid dedication to high standards, helps us perform and achieve our goals. And maybe it does. Maybe in some situations that are a little bit more stable and simple, it helps us. But what Australian researcher, resilience researcher, Dr. Monica Crane has found is that it actually distorts our thinking when it comes to dealing with failure in particular. So I'll share my screen again here. And there we go. You can see Dr. Monica Crane's research, that what she found is that it prevents us, this distortion to our thinking and this perfectionist thinking prevents us from seeing our failures clearly. It actually prevents us from building the resilience we need to deal with these crazy times that we are in right now. So basically, she says that perfectionist thinking, makes us feel worse about our failures. So we're more likely to fall into those emotional instincts that cause us to exit that intelligent failure loop. And she says that this happens in 3 dominant ways. That when we are in that perfectionist way of thinking, we tend to believe that any failure in one aspect of life is reflective of our overall ability in every other aspect of life, our stable ability, as in there's no chance that it can be changed with effort, and it's reflective of how others will view our ability. So I somewhat hope I don't need to say this, but just in case, I will emphasize that none of these beliefs is true. Right? A failure, no matter how bad it is, does not reflect our overall ability. It reflects a complex array of our actions and conditions in one moment in time. That is it. A failure definitely does not indicate that we will be bad at that forever. Of course, we can always learn and grow with effort. And I acknowledge that while others may judge or blame us for a failure, if we are able to acknowledge that failure transparently and put in the effort to learn, it transforms how people view our abilities. So none of those beliefs are actually true. So perfectionism is simply unhelpful because it prevents us from handling our failures intelligently. So how do we start to recognize when we're falling prey to that perfectionist thinking? Some good indicators are up on the screen in front of you. Things like you catch yourself telling yourself you should do something, or I need to, I must. I catch myself in this all the time, trying to motivate myself to do more, basically. We fall into that dysfunctional bifurcated thinking where we think it's either right or wrong, good or bad, perfect or garbage. When a failure happens, we think that it's evidence of our complete incompetence. We downplay or discredit any accomplishments we might have, attributing our success to luck and hard work. Or perhaps you find yourself fearing failure, doubting yourself, wondering if you're making the right call, and just worrying or anticipating that things are going to go badly. So my question to you is, as you read through this list of indicators of perfectionism, do any sound like something you do? Now, as a quick thought experiment, I'm going to invite a little scenario. I'm going to invite you to kind of imagine yourself in this scenario. You're 1 week into a new role. Your manager has just asked you to take the lead on an important task. You have no experience of this task. And your manager has only given you 2 days to spend on it. So imagine yourself in that position. And I would invite you just to reflect on what are the initial thoughts that come into your head as you find yourself in that position. And I'll give you a few seconds to reflect on that. as you're reflecting on those initial thoughts, those initial feelings, those reactions to that scenario, I'm curious, as you look back at the indicators of perfectionism, do you notice anything perfectionistic about those thoughts that helps you maybe identify where and when you might fall into perfectionism? So this line of inquiry brings me to the second reflection, to really think about how this concept plays into our context. So I'll invite Nabil again to put reflection question number 2 into the chat box so you have it as reference. How and where does perfectionism show up in your life most often? I know for me, at least, I use that should language to motivate myself all the time, but even just in like whole swaths of my life. For example, when I'm parenting, I give myself a lot of leeway. I know I'm not perfect and I'm like happy to learn and grow through that experience, but somehow at work, man, I am a crazy perfectionist. So I'm curious for you, how and where does perfectionism show up for you? And again, I invite you to put those answers in the chat box. Since that for many of you, you share my perfectionist tendencies. Thanks so much for sharing so openly. Now, if you're still thinking about how perfectionism shows up for you and you want to put that in the chat, share with your peers, of course, please continue to. I will just say, just to clarify, I guess, that striving for excellence is, of course, admirable. It's when we feel that our work has to be perfect, that we always have to be right, that we do ourselves that disservice. Perfectionist thoughts don't help us achieve our goals. They're threatening, they distort our thinking, they make us feel anxious, and they hinder our ability to learn and grow from our failures. Now, fortunately enough, Dr. Carol Dweck wrote this wonderful book called Mindset, all about how we turn that perfectionist thinking and replace it with a growth mindset. It would take me a whole session on its own to do that book justice. So allow me to offer the shortest of short summaries by means of one simple action that you can take away to try to battle that tendency that we have towards perfectionism. So your one simple action, when the inevitable failures strike and you're struggling and start that pain of perfectionism, you're beating yourself up, you're feeling like this is representative of your complete incompetence. I invite you to remember to something that I can learn from this. Whatever it is, whatever happens, I can learn from this. That's the one action to try to shift us out of perfectionist thinking into that growth mindset. And the author of Growth of Mindset is Dr. Carol Dweck. Thank you for the question there. Now, as a quick detour, just before we get to core concept number 3, I want to share one of the most profound ideas that I have come across to help us on that path to a healthy and productive relationship with failure. And it's through the metaphor of kintsukuroi. So it's the Japanese art of repairing pottery with gold. Recognizing that the piece is more beautiful. So kintsukuroi, the Japanese art of repairing pottery with gold, recognizing that the piece is more beautiful for having been broken. I fundamentally believe that, like this pottery, We can all, always move forward from our failure wiser and stronger for having failed. Failure has this potential to transform us in a way that successes never will. So my invitation to you going forward is that with every failure, big, small, is to take even one more step past that. How can I learn from this, dealing with our perfectionism, and ask, how might I repair with gold? How do I walk away stronger, wiser, more beautiful, perhaps more human for having failed? So that's all very nice, but perhaps you're saying, great, beautiful metaphor, Ashley, but how do I practically do that? In my day-to-day, I fail, what do I do? So that, of course, is what I have planned for core concept number 3 that I'd like to share with you. So I am going to give you an actual 3-step process for what you do when you fail. And I'm even going to invite you to grab Post-its or perhaps, a pad of paper you've got lying around, whatever, because it's nice to have something tangible, because what's going to happen is at some point, you're going to fail. And you're probably going to feel kind of crappy. And you're going to think, wait, I attended a session on this. And that failure lady, she gave me a 3-step process for how to deal with my failures. So your step 0 is to go find your Post-it that you're about to write down your 3 steps on. So find your Post-it. And on that Post-it, you will see step 1, do nothing. And I am so serious about this. You cannot learn anything while we're agitated and emotional around a failure. Our stress response diverts all of the neural activity away from our prefrontal cortex. It is literally impossible to think rationally, let alone creatively problem solve. Chances are you will do something stupid. You will exit the loop. You will make the failure worse if you try to do something in that moment. So don't. Really do nothing. Breathe. Hide under your desk. Stay in bed all day. Whatever you do to help yourself heal, that is your first job. And the idea here is to get emotional distance away from that experience of failure so that you're able to look at the experience more objectively without the extreme emotions that come with stress and shame and embarrassment. So that sounds like it should be really easy, right? Yeah, I know how to do nothing, no problem. Honestly, for most folks, this is the hardest step because it requires a huge amount of self-awareness to know that you're in that stress response and to really, okay, right, I should do nothing. And it takes an incredible amount of discipline to actually do nothing when everything in your body, head to toe, is screaming you need to fix this right now. But hopefully you found your Post-it, you've read your Post-it, you remember, right, I'm supposed to do nothing. I'm just supposed to calm down. And you take that breath and you take that time and you get that emotional distance. And when you're calm, you can move on to step 2, which is own it. So you'll remember previously I talked about countering perfectionism with that one simple action saying, I can learn from this. This is the time to say, I can learn from this. This is your step where we basically focus on what we need to take away from this event, what we need to change. So not why it happened, not who set you up for failure, just what you can learn. So to help with that reflection, I've offered 3 questions that you can ask yourself to help kind of guide yourself to learn what you need to from these experiences. Now, the goal in asking these questions is really to figure out what you have control over. Focus on that, change that. Again, sounds so much easier than it actually is in practice, because as you're asking that first question, what did I do or not do to contribute? I'm going to promise you that there's at least one, maybe multiple voices in your head going like, what do you mean? What did you do to contribute? This was totally not your fault. Look at all these other people and factors that like led to this thing that are not your fault. And all those factors are probably true. You know, it wasn't all your fault, but you can't learn from that and you can't change that. So focus on the pieces that you do have control over, the pieces, because I guarantee you, if you were involved in the failure, there is something you could have done or not done differently. And if those voices aren't yelling, what are you talking about? This is not your fault. Then you've got other voices that are yelling, this is all your fault. That's what my self-criticism voices really like to tell me. And I'd say that this step isn't about that brutal self-criticism either. It's about avoiding both of those extremes and instead simply sitting in the discomfort of that failure, avoiding the blame, avoiding the self-criticism, and simply asking ourselves, what do I have to learn from this? And figuring out what you can change. And once you've done that, we move to step 3, which is, maybe you saw this coming, repair with gold, because it is always possible to move forward from a failure with strength and wisdom. But of course, again, easier said than done. I mean, once bitten, twice shy is a saying for a reason. When we've just failed, we don't want to take more risks. We don't want to try again. We don't want to put ourselves out there again. It's really, really hard to want to move forward when we've just felt that pain of failure. And the irony is, the more important that goal is for you to accomplish, the more you feel reluctant to try again, not wanting to risk that painful failure again. So fighting that resistance to trying something new and picking yourself back up, it takes huge courage. I offer, again, 3 reflection questions to kind of help us counter that resistance. The first really asks us to connect with your motivation. Why is doing that something new? Why is figuring out that problem? Why is moving forward so important? What are you working towards? Useful mindsets for this question are around, I'm playing to win, not to protect myself from losing. And if you're still feeling that resistance to taking action, asking, what's the risk of staying the same? Really connecting to why your goal is so important. The second question, what from this failure is worth keeping, is really inviting us to sift through the rubble of the failure, because there's always things that went well that are worth keeping. Those might be systems and processes that you develop. They might be relationships. They might be insights. They might be intellectual property. They might be tools, maybe valuable lessons learned from going through step 2. But we just want to make sure that we're recognizing what those things are and holding them, and not, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as the saying goes. And finally, with those 2 questions asked, we can move to the third question, which is, how might I try again or move forward more wisely? This is a chance to consider how you and your work might be transformed by the experience. Do nothing, own it, repair with gold. Those are your 3 steps. And for our third reflection question, to align with our third core concept, I'll invite Nabil to put that reflection question in the chat so you have it for reference. It is inviting you to think of any failure that you've been a part of. Any failure. It can be big and small. It can involve you, involve many other people. It can be personal. It can be professional. It doesn't matter. Any failure you've been a part of. I invite you to think of that failure now. Hopefully you've got something in mind. Feel free to take a little bit longer to think of your failure, but I invite you, as you think about that failure, reflect on this 3-step process. How might you repair from that failure with gold? Or perhaps, how have you repaired with gold? So as an example, as I was preparing for this workshop, Baptiste from Legal Suite, he mentioned how they had this failure early on where they struggled when a client would buy their product or buy their software, but not adopt it, and instead keep kind of doing things in the old ways. Now, obviously, it's a common issue with any technology adoption, but Legal Suite was really determined to repair with gold, right? They wanted to become a stronger organization through this. So they realized through this failure, they needed another role, this account manager role, someone who could work with the client after implementation to ensure that they get the most out of the software. And Baptiste said, like, this often actually results in a stronger relationship with the client so that they, in fact, want more products from Legal Suite. So they managed to take this failure and turn it into, repairing with gold, becoming a stronger organization that has better relationships with their clients out of it. So how might you repair with gold from your failure? And that's what I invite you to reflect on and write in the chat box if you haven't already. Yeah, strengthening relationships, soliciting feedback. These are great ideas, guys. Thank you. This is wonderful. It's actually my favorite question to ask, is seeing how folks are thinking about repairing with gold, as it's always my hope for what's possible coming out of a failure. So thank you for sharing so openly again. Now, please continue to put your answers in the chat box. Love reading them. What I will say, though, in the interest of time, is that well, my goal for this time together was to offer some guidance on a pathway towards a healthier relationship with failure. But of course, that change doesn't happen in 45 minutes. This session is really just the beginning, and you get to decide what you do with these concepts and how you bring them back into your day-to-day lives. So that's what I'd like to focus on just for the next few minutes before we move to the formal Q&A portion, is just thinking about what we want to do with these ideas. How do we take these concepts back to our homes, back to our offices? Now, I realize this is a really tough ask. We're going from let's build a healthier relationship with failure to change your workplace. Not exactly easy, but I think it's worth it, and I think you're up for it. So I'm going to invite you to reflect on 3 questions that get us thinking about how we might take these ideas back to our offices. So in this case, I will put the reflection questions in the chat for you. The first one is reflecting on, what do you already do that fosters a healthy relationship with failure? So maybe you already do postmortems or after action reviews for yourself or at work. Maybe you have this great open dialogue where you talk about failures with your peers or your boss. Maybe just personally, you've decided that you want to embark on this journey and started reading books like those written by Brené Brown. This is a chance just to stop and appreciate the effort that you're already putting in. As well, if you want to share those answers in the chat, it's a chance to just share best practices with your peers. And I should also say the answer to this question, what you're already doing, it might be nothing. And that's fine too. That's absolutely a valid answer. It'll just make the next 2 reflection questions all the more important. But I'll give you a chance to reflect on, what are you already doing to build that healthy relationship with failure? Got some great suggestions coming in there. I'm going to put the second reflection question in the chat box, and it is, what about your current situation hinders your ability to have a healthy relationship with failure? So what might you need to stop doing? Are there expectations you're putting on yourself? Do you have pressure put on you by others? Or maybe it's something more structural, like you're working under these really strict budgets or performance metrics. Basically, what's preventing you from having the relationship with failure that you know you need to be able to learn innovate, and grow. And as you're thinking about that second question, that what might be holding you back from that healthy relationship with failure, I'd invite you to almost step back and maybe tap into that creative, big picture thinking part of you and think about, how might things be different? What could you actually change? And I'll put the third and final question into the chat box. This one's my favorite. What is one thing, even just one tiny thing, that you want to do differently or take away from this session? Anything that you want to stop doing or start doing to support that healthy relationship with failure. And I really do invite you to share this one in the chat, because I think it has that potential to inspire others who might be struggling to think of what they might do differently. So I'll give you a few seconds to reflect on what you want to do differently, and then we'll leave the rest of the time for Q&A. These are beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. All right, I love seeing these come in. Please continue to put your ideas for what you want to take away in the chat. But of course, I want to leave time for Q&A, because perhaps that reflection didn't leave you any answers and just left you a million more questions. So thankfully, we still do have a few minutes left for Q&A here. What is weighing on your heart and mind as you think about this topic? What are you struggling with? Maybe you've got just an idea that you just really want to get out there and share with your peers. Feel free to put that in that Q&A box. But I know Christine and Nabil have been watching the questions come in. I've also been watching your comments this whole time. So maybe I will pass it over to them and just ask what themes or questions have you seen come in that we should get started with this Q&A on?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ashley, for that. And I have to tell you, I've learned a lot from your wisdom today, but I have learned a lot by looking at the comment section. I mean, there was so much interaction from the 117 attendees that we have on the call today. It's awesome. I was reading that, and there's so much wisdom that is coming from everybody who's on the call today. It's beautiful. I love it. So we literally have you have been doing awesome. I wish you could go on and on, but we literally have 3 minutes left for the Q&A that we wish we had more. So if there's anybody amongst the attendees who have a question, I will invite them to please go ahead and ask now.
Perhaps, Nabil, I might start and just pose something, because I know as we were looking at developing this topic, one of the things I had mentioned to you, Ashley, was the culture that legal professionals are trained in and we grow up in, that we are taught and trained to be risk adverse, that we cannot fail. Our jobs depend on it, our clients depend on it, and it starts from day one in law school all the way through. So is there one, piece of advice or one thought that you could give us on how do we re-engineer that training, or what can we start to think about to change that mindset?
That's a great question. I think the first piece for me is really appreciating that mindset does serve you in some situations, right? Holding that responsibility and protecting our organizations from risk and feeling like we really should be right, because our companies need us to be right. I just want to recognize, we don't want to throw all that out. Obviously, there's a really important aspect to that. But what's needed more than ever, but I'd say increasingly so in the world that we live in, is a certain amount of ability to acknowledge that perfection, that getting it right every time, is absolutely impossible.
the things that we're being asked to do, the pace at which we need to adapt to things to keep up with the pace of change is incredible. So acknowledging there's value in that training and that thinking, but that it's going to hold us back from adapting as quickly as we need to in the world that we live in. So while we want to honor that way of being, we also at the same time need to ask ourselves that question of, what is the risk of staying the same? Like, what is the risk of delaying? What's the risk of taking an extra 5 days to get something out there, so it's 100% when it goes out, versus putting it out right now at 80%? Like, is it better to put it out at 80%? Because I'm going to guess that in a number of situations, that speed is actually what our businesses need more than perfection. And being really clear on those two, and building up that skill of being able to say, what's the risk of not acting, basically, and being willing to move forward with an 80% answer would be my one piece of advice.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Ashley, we have a couple of more questions in the Q&A. If we do not get a chance to address those, we'll definitely be including it in the follow-up email that the CCCA will send to all attendees today. So I think we can spare a minute or two. I like this one if you want to attend it quickly. My leader tends to default to, whose fault is this? So name the individual and I want them fired. How can I help shift the focus away from that?
I'm sorry. I know how common this is. How do you shift your focus away from that? So I'm doing a bunch of research right now on workplace courage. We tend to think that taking risky action and doing things, trying out those new ideas is something that's inherent in us. What we're actually finding in our research is that it's a team dynamic. Those we work with, and especially those we work for, have enormous influence on whether we're willing to take those risks or not. So our bosses in particular need to be aware that behavior, that whose fault is this, is going to virtually obliterate courage on the team. So what do you actually do with a leader who is looking for blame? I would invite, perhaps, maybe this sounds like a shameless plug, but maybe bring that intelligent failure loop to them and say, look, we need to be able to learn and grow and perhaps repair with gold from the failures that we have. And in order to do that, we have to avoid this blame culture, because it's going to make people shut down and not be willing to speak openly about what they learned along the way. Obviously, that takes a very tactful conversation and definitely a one-on-one conversation with a superior, but inviting them to realize that you really need a blameless approach to any failures is vital. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ashley. Once again, right on dot. So thank you. I want to thank everybody from the CCCA, Ashley, and all the attendees today who joined us. I hope the idea is that you guys walk away today with some value added and you learned lessons that were helpful. And I just want to remind everybody, Legal Suite is a player in the enterprise legal technology space. You want to talk about contract management, legal matter management, and stuff like that? Think about us. Thank you so much, guys. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Yeah. And thank you to everyone. My contact details there. Feel free to reach out. There is no conversation I'd rather have than that about failure. So thanks to all the participants and to our wonderful hosts at Legal Suite and CCCA. Thank you.